in order to make it possible for this seemingly inconspicuous company to produce independently. Although their production technology is still in the 1980s and 1990s, it is fortunate that the masters in the past have done this. In order to improve the overall processing efficiency, the masters on one side are fixing avermedia on the historical lathe and using the tong knife to carefully cut the interior of avermedia. The masters on the other side have already processed the exterior of avermedia during the whole opening. This time they need to use avermedia to process a two-way helical gear, so the master needs to use the tooth to draw a mark in the middle position so that the master can use the lathe tool. The groove in the middle position is used to divide the helical teeth on both sides for subsequent processing. This processing process is still very simple. The masters have completed the processing of the groove in the middle very quickly through skilled operation. The bottom of the cylinder has not been processed, so they only need to use the hanging chain to turn the direction, and then they can use the lathe tool to process the remaining positions. The masters on the spindle have already processed the holes on both sides. At that time, they had already started to use the blasting machine to cut the shaft and build the groove. The processing process was relatively slow, but they only spent more than an hour, and the processing was completed very quickly. The original cylinder needed to be assembled on the newly processed spindle later, and the internal shaft groove also needed to be processed. In this way, after they went through a lot of extremely hard operations, the internal shaft groove was finally processed. As for the spindle, the flower sword shaft had already been processed on the head. The purpose of doing so was to facilitate the subsequent docking. It looks complicated, but it is not simple at all. Although the processing equipment they used was relatively simple, the heads of these 6 spindles were still processed very quickly. After using the scraper to measure the overall concentricity, the avermedia side made marks on the avermedia by feeling to ensure that there was no deviation in the spacing of the processed teeth, and then used the ruler washing machine for detailed processing. If there is too much deviation, the processing can be accelerated. The guys on the spindle side need to process the diameter to the standard size since their processing equipment is low-end. The overall processing efficiency is not high. In order to control the processing accuracy and pass rate, some lathes are controlled at a relatively low speed. It took a long time to process the shoe ruler of the avermedia head and the cutting of the spindle surface. Now the spindle has finally been processed. For avermedia, the masters can also process the other side. After the masters disassembled the avermedia with the help of the aerial control, in order to ensure that the tooth spacing on the other side is not deviated, the masters will use steel paper for measurement and comparison. You can make marks by feeling. In this way, they can first cut out the tooth mark during processing and then make a detailed comparison. After observing that there is no problem with the spacing between the teeth, they can proceed with the processing with confidence. This processing process is basically automated. The master in charge of processing only needs to observe the cutting and elimination status. Such a two-way helical gear was finally processed after a day of processing. On the second day, in order to increase the hardness of the teeth, the masters also need to put it in the heating furnace. For heating in this process, they only need to heat it to a bright red color, and then they can use brittle oil to cool it. After heat treatment, it can not only improve the hardness and toughness of the teeth, but also improve the overall mechanical properties. The processed bidirectional helical teeth can be installed on the main shaft at this time. Although the masters have applied lubricating oil inside, the installation process is not so smooth because the clearance between the two is relatively tight. In order to assemble it in place, they are going to use another piece of steel to knock it. The masters use the air adjustment to pull the steel piece to a certain height, and then quickly release it to knock the main shaft into place. I have to say that their idea is still very good. After the main shaft and gears are installed, the strip cores on both sides can be rolled on the shaft and installed. Several young guys are operating with the head and face. The assembly process is still very fast. Next, they only need to install it in the reducer. Use bolts to tighten the warp firmly. At this time, the reducer is basically assembled. After watching the entire processing process of the Pakistani iron processing plant, what do you think of their craftsmanship? The result is very good. How many points would you like to get?